Tanse. My name is Matthew Wildcat. I'm an assistant professor of political science and Native studies here at the University of Alberta. I'm also a member of Ermineskin Cree Nation. What I wanted to do today with residential schools is not to give a big history or to talk about some of the opinions and thoughts about them, but to give a more of a personal history of my experience with residential schools. My story starts with my kukum. She went to Ermineskin Residential School. Ermineskin Residential School operated from 1916 to 1973. It affected 3 generations of my family. But for my kukum, she has this story that she would tell when she was alive, where Ermineskin Residential Schools was actually only a few kilometers away from where her parents lived, and she could climb to the 3rd floor of the building and look out and see her parents working in the field. They were farmers. But during that time, she wasn't actually allowed to see her parents. From September until June while she was at the school, she wasn't allowed to return home to visit. There was a few times where she was allowed to return home at Christmas, but for the most part, she had to go those 10 months of the year at school without seeing her parents. And to me, that story, it just really illustrates some of the dark history of residential schools, of separating parents from their children. And we often think about how it's children being taken away from their parents, but equally, Marie Wilson, one of the co-commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, said that it was also about parents being left behind, about parents having their children taken away from them. And so it's this double tragedy that happens. There was a time in Canada's history in the 1970s and 80s where most of the Canadian public had forgotten about residential schools or didn't understand that they really existed beyond how Indigenous peoples talked about them and remembered them. But in the 1980s, a number of survivors of residential schools started to launch lawsuits against the Canadian government, and those slowly over time got grouped together and eventually became a class action suit against the federal government. I think memory of residential schools in Canada at large, really there's this symbolic moment where Phil Fontaine is on national TV in the early 90s, and they're asking him about residential schools, and he comes out as saying he was sexually abused at residential schools. And I think for many Canadians, this was a defining thing of, this was something that people needed to pay attention to. And so even though today the Kamloops discoveries of all the graves are quite shocking, there's actually been many decades now, where Canadians have had an understanding of the different horrors at residential schools. For me, one of the stories that really defines my understanding of that period and that time, I was quite young still at the moment, is my uncle went to Saskatchewan to produce a play about residential schools, and people, again, were just starting to talk about them in a public manner, in a public way. And at this play, after it was done, there was an elder who got up in the crowd, and he took his hat off and he threw it on the ground, and he said, "That's what I was like before. I didn't have dignity. My hat was on the ground. And after this play, I can pick my hat up and I can hold it again, and this play has given me dignity." And so this is, being able to talk about residential schools has been a really important thing for survivors of them. So all of those individual lawsuits that started in the 1980s, by the 2000s, was launched against the federal government and resulted in a residential school settlement. So the residential school settlement was $1.9 billion, and it was split into 5 components. There was a common experience payment, a symbolic payment to survivors of residential schools. For those who had experienced severe mental, physical, or sexual abuse, there was an independent assessment process where people would go and tell their stories and could receive larger settlements. There was also money set aside for commemoration activities and a healing foundation, but the 5th element was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And what I find really important about that is that we think of the TRC probably as something that the federal government paid for, but actually I tend to think of it as something that survivors paid for, because this was money survivors received for all of the harms that they experienced at residential schools, and they decided it was important that they have a truth and reconciliation process so that people could tell their stories and it could be recorded for history. And I think that was a gift that survivors gave to people to run this commission. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions are actually a global phenomenon. They've happened in dozens of countries throughout the world, and they typically happen after a period of severe violence or of severe government oppression, and they're meant as a mechanism to try to heal or repair society in some sort of way. So the emblematic one is in South Africa after apartheid. They have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission where people come and tell the stories and all the horrors of apartheid. And it's meant as a way to try to heal society in some sort of way. So Canada's is unique in the sense that there was no formal break in how Canada was treating Indigenous peoples at this time. And it makes the story of the Truth and Reconciliation of Canada distinct in some ways. There's two other ways in which it's distinct. So one, no other truth commissions were brought about by court action. And then secondly, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada is the only commission aimed specifically at harms experienced by children. Reconciliation now is a term that is almost ubiquitous within Canadian society, and people use it in a wide variety of ways to describe both the attempts at healing this relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada, but also an aspiration that we can get to a place where we're decolonized or where we have a just relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. A lot of it is centered around these 94 calls to action, which was released by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And here again, I think there's a really interesting component. Murray Sinclair, the lead commissioner, he had been involved in a justice inquiry in Manitoba, looking into how Indigenous peoples were treated by Manitoba's justice system. And all of the recommendations they made there, he felt they went nowhere. They fell flat. And so he was really thinking deeply about how do I strategize about making these recommendations stick in some sort of way. What he did with the 94 calls to action was not just target what government should do, but what the general Canadian public could do. And when you read them, you can see that any organization or institution that you might be part of in Canadian society, usually there's a call to action there. And what it did is it meant that anyone in Canada could read those calls to action and personalize them in some sort of way as a way that they could take them up. And I think it's this smart thinking by Murray Sinclair, which has made them such a focal point in Canadian society today. There's also a number of critiques of reconciliation, this idea that we need to have truth before reconciliation, that the truth hasn't fully been understood by Canadian society. I think you partially see this with the discovery of the mass graves at Kamloops and now many other places throughout the country, is this reckoning that this was, the amount of people who perished at these schools. Indigenous peoples understood this, but clearly it was a shock to non-Indigenous Canadians. As well, many Indigenous peoples have suggested that that reconciliation has become about only reconciling past harms and not ongoing harms in Canada. And again, Indigenous peoples are insisting that there's still ongoing harms that Indigenous peoples experience every day. And I think you see those in the outcomes that Indigenous peoples have within Canadian society. And finally, there's this idea that what reconciliation is reconciling Indigenous peoples with the Canadian state. And what it means is that Indigenous peoples get brought into Canada rather than Canada having to change itself in order to become a new country that's able of having a just relationship with Indigenous peoples. I think one of the really important things for me about reconciliation is that it's been brought about by the political resistance of Indigenous people. So this is Indigenous peoples for decades pushing and calling for change. And what it's caused for Canada, I think, is a disconnect between how Canada understands itself as a country, a country of tolerance, diversity, freedom of expression, equal opportunity, and that's come into conflict with the actual history of the way in which Canada's treated Indigenous peoples, the horrors of residential schools. Specifically here, I think of residential schools as being genocidal in some ways. So very explicitly, Canada with residential schools sought to kill the Indian in the child. This is a genocidal statement that it was seeking to destroy and harm a people. People have a debate about whether it's prima facie or actual genocide, cultural genocide. But to me, those debates, they really obscure the fact that what was being done was trying to destroy peoples. And whether it was the result of direct killing or whether the result of trying to take away someone's culture, these and our understanding of genocide as it exists as a concept are acts of genocide. Moving forward, it's hard to know what we do about the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in this country. One, it's going to be a long-term project because to be able to have a good relationship, I think means building out capacity. Right now, in many respects, in all aspects of Canadian society, from law, professions, to business, to government. There's a lack of a capacity amongst non-Indigenous peoples for how we think about the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in this country, and that's going to take a lot of work, a lot of education, and it's a long-term project. But just because it's a long-term project, it doesn't mean that we can't have a sense of urgency. I think that sense of urgency means writing ourselves into the story in some way. Everyone has to write themselves into this story of the relationship, the colonial foundation that Canada is built on. And so I've shared some of my story with you today of how I come to understand this through not only my family's history, but through things that have really connected and resonating with me. And what I would leave everyone with is that for yourself, you have to think about what is it in your history, your experience, that allows you to understand these events. Some of them may be difficult events to grapple with, but being able to write yourself into that history, I think, is what's necessary to give us that urgency to be able to address it in the moment, and to be able to not just undertake the long-term project, but be able to undertake day-to-day actions right now, which will allow us to address this painful history in Canada.